Thank you, Miles, for that lovely introduction. And it's an honor to be a participant in this panel and a pleasure to be working with Demos and Essential Information. As a California consumer advocate whose focus has always been on pocketbook issues, I'd like to zero in for a little bit on how Main Street will be treated in the coming debate over solving the financial debacle. And I guess we have to ask the question of whether anyone will pay any attention to Main Street at all. To discuss this, I'd like to start with what seems like eons ago, the California energy crisis, which was a bit of a foreshock of the financial catastrophe that we're presently in today. You'll recall that the California legislature, by a unanimous bipartisan vote with no dissent, acted at the behest of Enron and the state's utility companies to deregulate electricity. And shortly after the electricity in California was deregulated, the price of electricity rose exponentially over a few weeks, to the point where the utility companies, which were barred under the law they wrote from passing through the higher costs, because everybody said that, gee, when you deregulate electricity rates, you're going to see lower prices. The companies were barred from passing through the higher costs that the energy wholesalers were charging utility companies, so the utility companies stopped paying. At that point, there was nobody paying the energy companies for the electricity that the state was consuming. So the Wall Street rating agencies and the investment banks that were closely connected to the energy companies insisted that California officials order the taxpayers to bail out the utility companies by paying the obscene prices for electricity on the so-called market. And of course, this is before anybody understood that the prices were being manipulated through phony shortages. At the time, we called on the governor to seize the power plants that the utility companies only a few years before, under the deregulation law, had sold to a complex of firms like Enron and Wall Street investment banks. We were able to defeat in the legislature a $10 billion bailout of Pacific Gas and Electric, at which point that company went into bankruptcy, which we all thought was the proper place for a company that had made a bad bet in the marketplace should be. And then soon after that, Enron collapsed, and it looked as though that scandal, which cost investors billions of dollars, would lead to stronger regulation and corporate accountability. But then 9/11 occurred, and for most of the last decade, American people have been told that our greatest enemy lives in a cave in Afghanistan. That was wrong. I think we need to start saying publicly what Franklin Roosevelt said 70 years ago, quote, "Our enemies of today are the forces of privilege and greed within our own borders." Today, the enemies of American consumers, taxpayers, and small investors live not in caves but in multi-million-dollar palaces. They pull down 7- or 8-figure annual paychecks, and they have done unspeakable damage to our country. As Warren Buffett famously put it, their weapons of mass destruction were pieces of paper that were backed by other pieces of paper, that were backed by packages of mortgages, student loans, and credit cards, the complexity and value of which nobody, it turns out, really understood. Meanwhile, after 9/11, Enron and corporate accountability disappeared in the cloud of dust that rolled through lower Manhattan that day. Californians, just from that so-called energy crisis, end up paying $70 billion. And that, of course, will be paid out repaid through bonds over the next few decades. The state budget, for those of you who know anything about California, state budget has never recovered. And the voters really were never heard in that entire debate from the moment deregulation occurred straight through to the present time. The only thing that really happened, the only way that voters were given a way to express themselves was when they were given the opportunity to recall the California Governor Gray Davis, and of course he was replaced by a cartoon character. But the fact is that much of what's happening in the country today might have been prevented had anybody really taken a look at what happened in California earlier in this decade. So for me, the question of how the crisis is going to be solved is inextricably linked to the question of who sets the terms of the debate and whether Main Street has any role in that. And that's why this conference today is so important. We have seen already what happens when the people responsible for the mess are allowed to determine how it gets fixed. Main Street gets nothing or even worse. For example, Treasury Secretary Paulson went up to the House with that 3-page bill last September, walked away with $700 billion, but with not one meaningful condition attached. Not even that the banks that got our money had to lend it. So they hoarded the money instead, or they used it to buy other banks. I was sitting outside the House Financial Services Committee hearing room when Paulson and Bernanke were testifying. You couldn't even get into the room because the bankers and the financial lobbyists apparently paid people the minimum wage to stand in line so that when the doors opened, the bankers could take their places and get a seat inside while myself and basically the rest of the American people were out in the hall. Another example, the Fed opened its discount window to borrowing at 2.25%, but placed no cap at what banks and credit card companies can charge us when we borrow our money back from them. And for many people, interest rates have soared since the bailout. So it's not just the quid pro quo for Main Street that's been missing in the $8.5 trillion rescue so far. The policy discussion itself has been very badly imbalanced and superficial, and certainly lacking the depth of inquiry that the American people deserve. The debate, let's talk about the debate over CEO pay as an example of that. Wall Street and many Washington officials have shrewdly framed the issue as whether CEOs should be forced to forego their bonuses. There has been little discussion over the symbiotic connection between the excessive levels of executive compensation generally and speculation in derivatives. No one has asked why firms that get a government bailout so that they can survive are allowed to pay their executives more than what top government officials make. Indeed, I think the time has come to raise the question, or to raise questions about, the very premises of the financial sector. It is not, in my view, in the best interests of America's economic security that finance generated 27% of all corporate profits in 2007. It's my guess that most Americans would view the collateral debt obligations, credit default swaps, and other complex derivatives that are in use today and that brought us to this point as a form of high-stakes gambling. We need to ask, as this panel has mentioned, what value they have and whether they should be permitted to be used in American finance at all. And if there's a silver lining of any kind for Main Street in this current debacle, it ought to be the opportunity to raise America's consciousness concerning the role government can play in an advanced and more just society. It cannot be that the only appropriate opportunity for massive government intervention is when it's necessary to save banks and insurance companies. For the $20 billion that the government gave Citigroup outright in November, we could have bought that company lock, stock, and barrel, and then we'd have our own credit card, student loan, and mortgage company run on careful business principles, but without the need to turn an enormous profit. Think of the assistance that would have offered to Main Street, not to mention the competitive effect it would have on the market.